Hello and welcome to the first of 4 videos that discuss in some detail the concept of adaptive leadership and adaptive change. This type of leadership, the theoretical framework for this type of leadership was established at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government by Ron Heifetz and several others who, working at Kennedy School, saw this style of leadership, this type of leadership, as one of the most effective, particularly when it comes to public sector, but also when it comes to navigating change. The framework that we're going to discuss has been put into action most successfully in Kansas by a group called the Kansas Leadership Center. KLC is a nonprofit organization that was begun by a former state senator there who looked at some of the health issues in the state and came to the conclusion that one of the best ways to make Kansas healthier was to focus on engaging the citizens of Kansas in public leadership. And so Kansas communities are the best examples really of where adaptive leadership has been implemented at scale. So as we talk about adaptive leadership, we're going to use many of the competencies and principles that come from Heifetz by way of the Kansas Leadership Center. And so we'll start with the 5 principles of leadership. And leadership, according to Heifetz and the KLC, is defined as mobilizing people to do difficult work. And this very simple 2-part definition of leadership is critical because it implies that leadership is about focusing on the most difficult work that we have to do in an organization, in a community, in our society. But it's also about mobilizing people. So it's very definitely a people business, and it's really important to understand that this can involve anyone. Leadership is an activity. It's not a position. It's not based on power and authority, although power and authority are certainly part of the ideas behind leadership and some of the aspects of leadership that we will discuss. It is really more of an activity in which anyone can participate anytime, anywhere. It starts with any individual, but it also must clearly engage others. It's about mobilizing people to do this difficult work. And then the last 2 components, the purpose is really an important component of leadership. That's one of the elements of why it's an activity and why it can involve anyone, because if you have that purpose that's clear, then leadership can happen if you are willing to make progress on difficult challenges and mobilize and involve others. The last component is that it's risky. It's risky because oftentimes leadership is challenging the status quo. It's not being willing to accept the story that others are willing to tell us about why things are happening and what things are happening. And so it is really a risky business. The chart on the right-hand side of this slide really talks about the 4 competencies that we're going to be working on through adaptive work. And it talks about why this adaptive model is the best model, according to KLC Heifetz, for navigating change. And that's where you take situation of what concerns you about your organization, your college, your community, whatever it might be that you're leading, and you look at where the gap is between where things are now, what your concerns are, and what your aspirations are. And so we're going to navigate through this road that focuses on these 4 competencies: diagnosing a situation, which we'll talk about through the rest of this presentation. Our next presentation will be about managing the leadership challenge, mostly managing yourself through that leadership challenge. And then the third, energizing others and engaging others in this work. And then the 4th and final is how you intervene and how you are skillfully engaging in making progress around the challenge that you are leading your organization, your community, your school, your church, whatever it is that you're leading. And so let's talk about diagnosing the situation and this competency. The two really important components of this competency, the first, and maybe Heifetz would say the most important aspect of really diagnosing a situation, is distinguishing between technical versus adaptive challenges. And so we'll talk a good bit about what those are and how you do that. The second big component of diagnosis is identifying who needs to be engaged, who needs to do the work, who's not at the table. So let's start with this idea of technical versus adaptive. If you look at the chart here, you can see that leadership challenges involve both technical aspects and adaptive aspects. And it's really important that leaders understand that the kind of situations that will involve adaptive change and real sustainable change in your organization, your community, whatever entity it is you're leading, are those kind of challenges that are adaptive. Technical work is work that's really dedicated more to problems that are technical, as it sounds. They're clear, the solution's clear, the problem is clear. The work is really done by people who have done this. There's like a manual to figure out how to do it. It's been done before. You simply need somebody who knows how to do it, who's the authority, who can come in and do it. They can do it pretty efficiently. They can do it very quickly, and they can fix it. The problem will go away. And so the attitude around technical work is one of confidence and skill. Adaptive work, on the other hand, is work where the solution hasn't maybe ever been found. It isn't easy to find. It isn't even easy to identify and define. And so the problem and the solution both require learning. They both require looking at the circumstance from a lot of different perspectives and learning about and testing. And so the work is usually engaged by stakeholders. If you are trying to do this work as the leader alone, you will not be effective, because it requires learning, because it requires reaching out and involving others. And so the type of work is experimental, because again, the solution is not easily apparent. It's maybe not ever really been attempted or found. And so it is experimental. It requires learning. It requires experimentation and different kinds of interventions. The timeline is long-term, and the expectation is not so much to fix it, but to make progress, to hit benchmarks and goals. And so the attitude around adaptive work is one of curiosity. It's one of trying to make progress over a sustained period of time. Heifetz is very fond of saying that technical work dwells in the head, where adaptive work dwells in the heart. It really impacts the values, the beliefs, and the core part of people that are engaged in this work, rather than just those who can solve the problem quickly, efficiently, and technically. And so part of diagnosing a situation is observing, interpreting, and intervening. And so we're going to talk about three different broad categories of observation and interpretation. And you have to, as you begin to diagnose challenges in leadership situations, you have to look at all three of these groups of interpretations and ways that you could potentially intervene. First is the technical versus adaptive, and we've already talked about that. And most leadership challenges have technical elements and adaptive elements. But they also have things called benign elements and conflictual elements. Benign elements are basically the easy way to find the answer. The compromises in some cases, the things that really avoid any kind of head-to-head conflictual situation. And of course, the opposite of that is conflictual interpretations. And conflictual interpretations really require you to push the envelope and sometimes to confront circumstances that might not be comfortable or even easy. Sometimes the easy win-win situation, even though some leadership theories talk about look for the win-win, sometimes the win-win just solves the problem temporarily or really doesn't address the really core undergird or issue beneath the problem that conflictual interpretations will approach. The same can be said for individual versus systemic. Individual interpretations are where sometimes we want to blame leaders. We want to blame the mayor in your community for why things aren't happening, or you want to blame the president of the university. But you really have to look at the systemic issues, the issues that are system-wide, that are bigger picture. And sometimes you have to really explore those interpretations that are bigger systemic issues to really get to the bottom of a lot of the kind of challenges that you have to deal with in leadership. And so looking at the differences between observations and interpretations, observations really are data. They're a detailed examination of phenomena prior to an interpretation, observing, the act of noticing with your senses, the details, the events, the patterns. Sometimes this data might be the kind of data you collect in a laboratory or a statistician. But a lot of times this observation might just mean talking with people. It might just mean observing how people interact. It might be observing what their impressions are as they react to things on social media or what have you. Interpretations, on the other hand, are explanations. They're explanations of the meanings of these observations, and interpreting really assigns the kind of meaning you need to move forward and look at these kind of interpretations. And so you want to really make interpretations, and those interpretations, you need to be cognizant of the technical versus the adaptive. The technical might be the easy, the benign might be the easy, the individual might be the easy. The more difficult, the more challenging, pushing yourself into these really difficult situations really require looking at them from an adaptive standpoint, from more of a systemic standpoint and more of a conflictual standpoint. And so let's move on to understanding process challenges. And these challenges are challenges that happen. They can be thought of as the problems behind the problems, or even sometimes the problems behind those problems. A lot of times process challenges are people challenges, and a really good example of process challenges sometimes are political challenges that you don't ever anticipate. As we look at the pandemic, for example, one of the really, really significant process challenges that have come up as a result of the pandemic is not so much whether we need to wear a mask. The science, that's a technical interpretation about the science behind what the mask does to help prevent the spread of virus. But the process challenge has become all the politics behind wearing a mask, and all the notion of individual rights, and all the notion of I don't have to be made to do this by the government. And so that's a really, really good example of a process challenge. And most adaptive challenges involve multiple process challenges that leaders have to understand how to navigate. And so as you begin to put these interpretations together, you want to test those interpretations, and you want to look at multiple points of view. And so don't be comfortable with the story authority wants you to tell, or the story that is the most popular one, or the one that you've tested that everybody seems to agree with, even though it might not be the right way to go. But you have to test those different interpretations and different points of view so that you understand those, and that you understand how to think about looking at your challenge and what the issues related to that challenge are. And again, this is a really good summary that we will address when we come together face to face, thinking about your challenge from the different interpretations, but also thinking about how you observe and interpret and intervene and test those challenges. And a lot of times testing those challenges really just means talking to different groups of people, talking to people that are the usual suspects, but also the unusual suspects, the people who would be your antagonists, and also looking at circumstances in the future, testing in your own mind about what this challenge will look like 50 years from now. What will your grandchild say about this leadership challenge? And an important component in helping people through change is heat. It's the temperature. The circumstances dictate that there needs to be heat oftentimes. If there's not enough heat, you won't get people energized, you won't get people believing that change needs to happen. But sometimes you have too much heat, and sometimes too much heat, just like your food, not enough heat, it might taste bad. Too much heat, and it might be bad for you. Too much heat also might not be appealing. It might taste bad. It might ruin what you're going to eat. So you have to look at a situation by regulating the temperature and taking the temperature and understanding that the circumstances need to be hot enough. The whole race issue in our country that occurred in 2020 really is a good example of having enough heat around a situation to really mobilize and energize people. Too little heat, maybe there wasn't enough interest, maybe the impetus wasn't there, maybe the desire wasn't there on the part of a larger group of people. Too much heat, people may feel unsafe and they may want to slow down. And so it's really important to look at what the temperature is and understand that heat is part of change. And then take a look at who needs to do the work. This is really the last component of diagnosing a situation. And oftentimes it's difficult because leaders typically, and this is the sense of what Heifetz is trying to say when he says leadership is not necessarily based on a position, it's an activity. Because the biggest realization is that it's not just the leader, it's not just the traditional person in authority who needs to do the work, it's the stakeholders. It might mean that involves lots of different factions. You need to identify who all those factions are and who all the stakeholders are. And this mapping activity of the usual and the unusual voices is a really good exercise to go through to try to determine, based on the XY plot here, who has stake in the issue. And stake is a person's interest in the issue. How does it affect them? But also their influence. Who has position in a hierarchy and authority to make a difference in an issue. And so those usual voices are typically those voices that are in power, that their power is vested. Sometimes they're elected officials, they're the company hierarchy. In a college or university, it might be the president, the board of regents, the leadership team, sometimes the most powerful, influential faculty. Some of those unusual voices might be students. It might be different student groups. It might be junior faculty. It might be sometimes the community that the school's located in. It depends on the issue. And then, so identifying those unusual voices and figuring out how you hear from them, how you test interpretations and get their points of view is really important. But then also looking at that group who have high influence, but maybe not high stake. Who are the conveners? There are circumstances where those conveners might be foundations. In some cases, it might be state government that have high influence, but they may not have as much of a stake in what happens. Sometimes they do have a stake, if it's a college or university, for example. Sometimes also in a college and university, it might be the community. The community might have a lot of influence, but they, maybe not have a lot of stake in some of the decisions that are made. And of course, some of the decisions, they'll have a whole lot of stake. So depending on the issue, that degree of influence and stake is going to be different for all of the different problems and challenges that you face in leadership, and trying to sort through where all these different factions and stakeholders fall is a really important exercise to go through. So in the next presentation, we're going to talk about managing this issue and how you manage yourself through this issue.